What just happened over there in the Middle East is something most Americans haven't fully absorbed yet, and honestly, the mainstream media is doing a terrible job of helping you understand the weight of it. So let's slow down, sit with this for a moment, and actually talk about what it means when a $500 million American defense system gets wiped off the map by a country that Washington has spent decades trying to contain. Satellite imagery taken on March 6, 2026 confirmed what military analysts had feared: a blackened THAAD radar surrounded by debris at the Muwafaq Salti air base in Jordan, over 500 miles from Iranian territory. That image, quiet and clinical as it appears on your screen, represents something seismic. It represents a crack in the armor of American military supremacy that nobody in Washington is eager to explain to you in plain English. But that's exactly what we're going to do right now. According to U.S. defense budget documents, a single AN/TPY-2 radar costs close to $500 million, and it serves as the core detection system for THAAD missile defense batteries, helping detect and track ballistic missiles and drones, enabling interceptors to engage targets before they reach their destination. This wasn't some secondary piece of equipment. This was the eyes, this was the brain. Because only about 10 AN/TPY-2 radar systems are believed to exist globally, the destruction of the Jordan-based unit introduces operational uncertainty into the missile defense architecture, protecting Jordan, Israel, and other regional assets during a period of heightened strategic tension. And here is the part that should make every single American stop and think very carefully. The fact that the radar was reportedly destroyed by single-use attack drones, which cost approximately $20,000 to $60,000, depending on the model, highlights a major point of vulnerability in U.S. military doctrine. You read that correctly. A drone that costs less than a used pickup truck in rural America destroyed a radar system worth $500 million of your tax money. That asymmetry, that brutal cold arithmetic of modern warfare, is what this video is really about. Because once you understand that equation, you start to see the entire geopolitical chessboard differently. This is not just a story about one radar in Jordan. This is a story about power, about illusions, about the gap between what the American military-industrial complex sells to the American public and what actually happens when the shooting starts. And that story, as uncomfortable as it is one that every American who is paying attention right now absolutely needs to hear. So let's begin from the very beginning. Let's trace how we got here, why this moment matters more than the headlines suggest, and what it tells us about the direction the world is moving, because that direction affects your life, your economy, your security, whether you follow geopolitics or not. It began, as so many modern conflicts do, with a decision made in the corridors of power that the public was barely consulted on. On February 28, 2026, Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, was assassinated in an Israeli air attack on his compound, and within hours, the Iranian government declared 40 days of mourning as Iranian forces reacted by launching missiles and drones. This was the triggering event, or rather the publicly acknowledged triggering event, because anyone who has been following the trajectory of US-Iranian relations over the past several years understands that this war didn't start on February 28th. It had been building brick by brick, sanction by sanction, proxy by proxy for decades. What happened on that day was simply the moment when the slow burn became an open fire. Now, the Trump administration put forward several explanations for initiating this campaign, and they changed those explanations more than once. Administration officials offered diverse and changing justifications: to preempt Iranian retaliation against US assets, to destroy Iran's missile and military capabilities, to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, to secure Iran's oil resources, and to achieve regime change by bringing the Iranian opposition to power. When a government needs that many reasons for a war, it usually means none of them is the whole truth. That's not cynicism. That's pattern recognition. That's looking at history and understanding how power speaks when it doesn't want to speak plainly. And Iran's response? It was not the collapse that some in Washington apparently expected. By March 5, 2026, a military source told Fars news agency that Iran had fired over 500 ballistic and naval missiles and almost 2,000 drones since February 28, with almost 40% of the launches aimed toward Israel and almost 60% fired toward US targets in the region. 2,000 drones. Think about what that number actually means operationally. Think about what it costs to intercept 2,000 drones, one by one, when each interceptor missile costs millions of dollars and each incoming drone costs a few tens of thousands. Iran had done the math. Washington, it appears, had not. And this is where the story of the THAAD radar destruction becomes philosophically important, not just militarily important. Because what Iran demonstrated in the opening days of this conflict was not brute force, it was doctrine. It was a deliberate, calculated strategy to blind the American military machine before it could see what was coming. Within the emerging strategic narrative of the conflict, the destruction of the radar illustrates a shift toward precision counter-sensor warfare in which Tehran appears to prioritize blinding surveillance and tracking systems rather than merely overwhelming interceptors through missile saturation. Read that again. Iran wasn't just throwing missiles at American bases randomly. Iran was studying the architecture of American military power, understanding which systems feed information to which other systems, which radars talk to which interceptors, which communication nodes, if severed, leave the whole network stumbling in the dark. And then Iran went after those specific nodes, methodically and deliberately, with the kind of precision that Washington assumed only it possessed. Kelly Greco, a senior fellow at the Stimson Center, said the pattern points to deliberate targeting rather than opportunism, noting the strikes were systematic and targeted three distinct functional categories: radar and communications infrastructure, aerial refueling tankers, and now AWACS, each being a critical enabler of U.S. air operations. This is strategic thinking. This is a country that has spent years, possibly decades, studying the American way of war and identifying its structural vulnerabilities. And the fact that this surprises so many Western analysts and commentators tells you something important about the assumptions built into the Western strategic worldview. The assumption that the adversary is less sophisticated, less deliberate, less capable of the kind of systemic thinking that Washington considers its exclusive domain. Let's talk about the AWACS for a moment, because that story is just as revealing. An Iranian missile and drones reportedly hit the Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, and the attack damaged multiple KC-135 tankers which refuel U.S. aircraft in flight, and an E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control system aircraft, with at least 15 American soldiers wounded and 5 in serious condition. The KC-135 tankers and the AWACS aircraft, these are not glamorous weapons. They don't make the kind of footage that sells defense contracts on Capitol Hill. But they are absolutely foundational to how American air power actually operates in a theater of war. Without the tankers, your fighter jets can't reach their targets. Without the AWACS, your entire battle space becomes fragmented and blind. You lose the ability to coordinate, to direct, to see the full picture from above. And Iran knew that. About half of the 16 aircraft E-3 fleet is mission capable, and with 6 deployed to the Middle East, only 2 or 3 remain for other needs, creating what one analyst described as very little slack remaining for flexibility and adjustment. That's a staggering number when you sit with it. Half the fleet is not mission capable, even before you account for combat losses. America went into this conflict with a fleet already stretched thin, already operating at reduced capacity, and Iran has been systematically degrading what remains. This is not the picture of overwhelming American dominance that was sold to the public. This is a picture of a military superpower discovering in real time the limits of its own reach. And what about the financial dimension? Because this matters enormously in the long run for the American taxpayer and for American strategic capacity. There are only 9 THAAD radars in the world, and losing 2 in 4 days has created a massive interception gap that will take years to fill. Years, not months. Years. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army expended over 150 anti-ballistic missile interceptors from the THAAD system to intercept Iranian ballistic missile attacks during the 12-day conflict in June 2025, depleting over 25% of its total global arsenal, with each THAAD interceptor launch costing approximately $15.5 million. And the February 2026 conflict is far more intense. The rate of depletion is accelerating. The stockpiles that took years to build are being consumed at a pace that the defense industrial base simply cannot match in real time. This has sparked fears among Iran's rivals that reserves of advanced interceptors like THAAD and PC-3 may soon be critically depleted, with defense contractors including Lockheed Martin and RTX meeting at the White House as the Pentagon pushes to speed weapons production. And there it is, the defense contractors arriving at the White House hat in hand, talking about accelerating production. Trump himself announced that the largest defense manufacturing companies had agreed to quadruple production of what he called exquisite class weaponry. quadruple production. Do you understand what that implies? It implies that the current production rate is so insufficient that they need to multiply it 4 times just to try to keep pace with what's being consumed. That's not a sign of strength, that's a supply chain emergency dressed up in patriotic language. Now let's zoom out and talk about what this all means structurally, because that's the conversation that almost nobody in the mainstream media is willing to have. What we are watching in real time is the stress testing of the American military model. A model built on technological supremacy, on the assumption that superior hardware automatically translates to decisive battlefield dominance. A model that has not been seriously tested against a peer or near-peer adversary in decades, not since the Cold War standoffs that ended without a shot being fired between the major powers. What Iran has done is force a live test of that model, and the results are not flattering. As Carnegie Endowment Senior Fellow Dara Massikot put it, ground-based air defense interceptor missiles are not infinite, and the United States and its partners and allies have had stockpile challenges in this area for years. Years. This isn't a new problem that Iran exposed. This is a structural vulnerability that existed before the first missile was fired, and anyone who was paying careful attention already knew it. The question was always when, not if, it would be exposed in a live conflict. That moment has now arrived. And then there's the drone equation, which may be the single most important strategic lesson of this entire conflict for anyone trying to understand where global military power is heading. Iran has been producing and deploying drones at a scale and cost efficiency that fundamentally changes the economics of warfare. Loitering munitions have become a central component of modern combat operations, fundamentally altering the relationship between detection and strike, their defining characteristic being the integration of ISR and strike into a single platform, enabling decentralized units to execute precision attacks independently with significantly reduced decision timelines. What this means in practice is that the old model, where military power was measured primarily by the sophistication and cost of your offensive weapons, is being replaced by a new model where volume, persistence, and asymmetric cost ratios matter as much or more than individual weapon quality. Iran can produce a drone for $20,000 and send it against a $500 million radar. The math works in Iran's favor at a fundamental level, and no amount of exquisite weaponry changes that underlying arithmetic. The only way to change it is to fundamentally rethink the architecture of American military power, and that rethinking, if it happens at all, will take a generation. Now let's talk about the global ripple effects, because this conflict does not exist in a vacuum. What happens in the Persian Gulf affects oil prices, shipping routes, global economic confidence, and the calculations of every other country watching to see how this plays out. Iran has essentially blocked the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of global oil and gas passes, sending oil prices above $100 per barrel, a jump of roughly 40% from before the war. That price increase lands on the kitchen table of every American family. It lands in the cost of groceries, of heating, of transportation, of everything manufactured or shipped using energy. The war in the Gulf is not an abstraction for working Americans. It is a direct tax on their daily lives, even if they don't see it labeled as such. And while Washington is absorbed in the military campaign, the rest of the world is drawing its own conclusions. Russia and China have raised their voices against the strikes. NATO, despite providing some logistical support from individual members, has explicitly declined to be drawn into the conflict as an alliance. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte clearly stated that NATO will not get involved in this war. That is a significant statement. It means that America's most important alliance structure has looked at this conflict and decided collectively that it does not want to be associated with it. That decision reflects a broader global judgment that the United States is increasingly acting unilaterally in ways that its own closest allies are uncomfortable endorsing. And consider what's happening to the broader posture of American military power globally. On March 10, 2026, due to the Iran war, the U.S. Army began relocating some THAAD interceptor missiles from South Korea to the Middle East. Think about what that means for the security architecture in Northeast Asia. Every missile moved from South Korea to the Gulf is a missile that is no longer available to deter North Korea, no longer available to reassure Japan, no longer available to contribute to the balance of power that keeps the Indo-Pacific from tipping into instability. American military resources are finite. Every commitment in one theater is a cost to capacity in another. The Iran war is not just a Middle Eastern story. It is reshaping the global distribution of American military power in ways that will have consequences far beyond the Gulf. Joe Costa, director of the Atlantic Council's Forward Defense Program, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, captured it precisely. The real cost is the cumulative impacts this operation will have on long-term readiness for other U.S. priorities. The more assets we use and lose now, the less will be available later until maintenance cycles, repairs, and new purchases are complete. Long-term readiness, that phrase carries enormous weight. It means that even if the United States achieves its near-term military objectives in Iran, whatever those objectives actually are at this point, the cost of achieving them will be felt for years in reduced capacity, in constrained options, in a military machine that has consumed a significant portion of its most advanced and irreplaceable assets in a single campaign. What we are witnessing, if you step back far enough to see the whole picture, is not simply a military conflict between the United States and Iran. We are witnessing a moment of historical inflection, a moment when the assumptions that have underpinned the American-led world order since 1991 are being tested against reality, and reality is pushing back harder than the architects of that order anticipated. The unipolar moment, the era of unchallenged American military dominance, the period in which Washington could launch military campaigns with confidence that no adversary could impose serious costs, that era is ending. It may not end tomorrow or next month or even this year, but the ending has begun, and the THAAD radar sitting in the rubble of Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan is one of its most vivid symbols. This doesn't mean America is weak. It doesn't mean the United States military is incapable or that its men and women in uniform are anything less than extraordinarily dedicated and capable. What it means is that the world has changed. Other countries have studied the American way of war, identified its vulnerabilities, and developed strategies to exploit them. The age of free rides, of projecting power without paying costs, is over. And the sooner Americans have an honest national conversation about what that means for strategy, for resource allocation, for the kind of role the United States should play in the world, the better prepared the country will be for the decades ahead. Because the real question this conflict raises is not whether Iran can destroy a THAAD radar. Clearly, it can. The real question is what kind of world America wants to live in, and what kind of power it wants to be in that world. And whether the people making those decisions in Washington are asking themselves that question with the seriousness and honesty that the moment demands.